Surrealism is a very strange and vague concept. As I mentioned in the main video, the word surreal didn't even exist until the early 20th century, and when it was first used it applied to music, not the visual arts. Later on, most members of the so-called Surrealist movement completely disagreed with each other on what the movement was actually about. Often the term was just a label that got slapped on things that a reviewer or critic couldn't quite figure out. It's a lot like the so-called Romantic movement. This was a term that originally applied to literature, and later spread to art and music, but its characteristics are very poorly defined. What makes Beethoven a romantic composer, or Turner a romantic painter? And by the same token, what makes a piece of music or a painting or a video game surreal? For most of us, classifying these things comes down to the idea of, I know it when I see it. And the funny thing is, even though there's no real definition of surreal, most people do have a pretty clear idea of what's surreal to them. And in the minds of many gamers, the idea of surrealism is very strongly associated with Japan. When we look at horror, for instance, Western games seem to focus on blood and guts, monsters with huge teeth, and stealth-based gameplay that punishes you for messing up with jump scares. Japan, by contrast, is the home of Silent Hill, Clock Tower, and Persona, which owe their scariness more to a slow burn of surreal imagery and background details that seem ever so slightly wrong. Even a more traditional Japanese horror game, like Resident Evil, has its fair share of really bizarre moments.
I got a shotgun.
Chris Redfield.
This isn't restricted to horror, though. Japanese studios also have quite a surreal sense of humor, and plenty of their more lighthearted games are equally weird. Just look at Katamari Damacy, Earthbound, or Pepsi Man. You can take almost anything and make it surreal if you're creative/insane enough to try. However, as I've said previously, most games are only surreal in short bursts, or in a sort of background way that doesn't relate to the mechanics. This is because to be a satisfying experience, most games have to follow some kind of template when it comes to gameplay and even story elements. A truly surreal game would be frustrating, because it would be impossible to figure out, and if it was really dedicated to being as wigged out as possible, you probably wouldn't be able to win the game in any meaningful sense. In other words, this hypothetical game would be a lot like Yume Nikki, a freeware PC game made in RPG Maker by a mysterious developer known only as Kikiyama. Yume Nikki is about as close as you can get to a purely surreal gaming experience. It has no real goal, no dialogue, and gameplay that consists almost entirely of walking around through freakish landscapes set to a minimalistic looping soundtrack. The whole thing feels very much like a dream, which isn't surprising, because every run of the game begins with our protagonist, Madotsuki, falling asleep. The clue is right there in the title. Yume Nikki in Japanese literally means dream diary. By the way, if you were a little mixed up and thought the main character would be named Nikki, based on the game's title, don't worry, you're not alone. Madotsuki doesn't have much of a visible personality, but she does have a mind of her own. If you try to make her go out the front door of her room in the real world, she'll shake her head and stay put. The only thing she will do, apart from going to sleep, is play a really terrible NES-style game called Nasu, or Eggplant. But the real meat of the game begins when Madotsuki goes to bed and appears in a dream version of her room. Now she will go through the door, but instead of an apartment building, the door leads to a black void containing many other doors leading to various worlds. As you explore these worlds, Madotsuki runs across many strange creatures and objects, some of which give her effects that change her appearance and abilities, allowing her to affect the environment and sometimes access new areas. Now wait a minute, I hear you saying. I thought you said there were no goals in this game. Don't these effects count as a goal? Well, no, they don't, and here's why. Madotsuki's effects may give you access to new areas, but those areas don't lead to each other with any kind of structure. The only reward you get for finding them is finding them. The same thing is true for the effects themselves. Most of them are cosmetic, and even when they help you solve a puzzle, so to speak, there's no acknowledgement from the game of your achievement. This is really a game that makes you more of a witness or a bystander than an active participant. The point is just to see it. Yume Nikki also technically has an ending, which I'm not going to spoil except to say that, and I know I sound like a broken record at this point, it's not really an ending. If anything, it's more like a visual depiction of why a game like this couldn't possibly have an ending, because that would fundamentally change what kind of game it is. This isn't an RPG or an adventure game or anything like that. It's just surreal. In fact, Yume Nikki is an experience that embodies the contradictory nature of surrealism itself. It's not a horror game, but it often comes across as quite disturbing and scary. When it's not scary, the game is often just weird in a mildly silly way, but it's definitely not a comedy either. It's full of what looks like living creatures that ought to have some kind of personality, but apart from moving around, none of them really exhibit any signs of life or animation, like an entire cast of Frisks from Undertale. Surrealist artists often described their works as being like dreams, but it's important to remember that they didn't literally want to reproduce the experience of dreams that people actually have. Many people's dreams do involve speaking to other people, as well as logical connections between events that happen in the dream. After all, people don't instantly turn schizophrenic just because they're asleep. But Surrealists wanted to capture the feeling of being asleep and dreaming, that strange, numinous feeling that we're connecting with parts of our minds that we don't completely understand. It's no coincidence that the peak of Surrealism's popularity coincided with a surge of public interest in Freud and the unconscious. In the same way that Monet would try to paint a haystack as it appeared at one specific instant to him, Surrealists were trying to portray a symbolic representation of dreams as they understood them, not the dreams themselves. And in precisely the same way, Yume Nikki is a great work of Surrealist art. It's not about dreams per se, it's about the way dreams make us feel. And the fact that you interact with it, in however limited a way, makes it a unique experience. You don't often hear of video games being described as a cult experience, but if there is such a thing as a cult game, then Yume Nikki is definitely one. The website that originally hosted it appears to be defunct, but the game is available for free on Steam, so really, you have no excuse for not at least trying to experience it. But hey, that's just my opinion. A game opinion.